Hello, my little gremlins. It's spooky story time. Where we left off with the monkey's paw, we had our four main characters Sergeant Major, Mr. White, Mrs. White, and Mr. and Mrs. White's son, Herbert. So, Sergeant Major gave Mr. White the monkey's paw. However, he warns them that it's better off being burned because all the monkey's paw does is bring a lot of pain to the point where the last person who had the monkey's paw wished for death as their final wish. So we have the White family, and they thought, let's just wish for 200 pounds, just enough to pay off the houses. So that's where we left off. We had everyone peacefully going about their day. Herbert left for work, and Mr. and Mrs. White are back at the house waiting for however they're going to get their money. So a lot of you predicted that they'll get the money through working for it. Maybe they'll get it as a gift. But we are going to see how W. Jacobs writes their final wish. Okay, so let's begin. Later that day, there was a knock at the door. It was the postman. Mrs. White took the letters from him and looked at them. There was a bill. Mrs. White sighed. She showed it to Mr. White. We don't have any money to pay for it, she said. The paw moved in my hand last night. I felt it, said Mr. White. Perhaps you made a mistake, suggested Mrs. White. No, said Mr. White. Mr. White stopped talking and looked at his wife. What's the matter? Mrs. White did not reply. She looked out the kitchen window, and Mr. White looked too. They watched a man outside their house. The man walked past their house, stopped, then he came back. Then he walked away again. Then he stopped, shook his head, and returned. 3 times he did all of this. Mr. and Mrs. White watched him do it. Finally, he walked away, stopped suddenly, opened the garden gate, and walked up the garden path to the house. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. White stood up and went to the door. Mrs. White welcomed the stranger into the house. The man did not look happy. He stood silently, and Mrs. and Mr. White waited quietly for him to speak. After a while, the man started. I'm from, he said, but stopped. He looked at the floor, moved his feet. He started again. I'm from Ma and Meggings, the factory in town. Mr. and Mrs. White recognized the name immediately. Their son, Herbert, worked at Ma and Meggings. Is there something wrong? Mrs. White asked. Did something happen to Herbert? What is it? Tell me. Please, dear, said Mr. White, sit down for a moment. We do not know anything yet. Perhaps this man has good news for us. Mr. White looked at the man, but the man looked sad. I'm sorry, the man said. I have bad news. Your son is badly hurt, but he's not in pain. Mrs. White started to speak. Thank God for that. She said. But then she stopped and looked at her husband. His face was very sad. Suddenly she understood. Her mouth dropped open, but no noise came out. Mr. White slowly reached out and took his wife's hand. Herbert fell into the machinery, said the man slowly. Fell into the machinery, Mr. White repeated quietly. He squeezed his wife's hand and looked out of the window. No one spoke. A heavy silence fell over the room. Mr. White held his wife's hand tightly. When he spoke again, his voice was weak. He was our only child, he said. Our poor, poor boy. The man nodded and walked to the window. Ma and Meggings want me to tell you. He stopped. The next words were very difficult for him to say. Well, they're very, very sorry. There were no reply. The old woman's face was white and the old man's eyes were red and tearful. But the man had to continue. Ma and Meggings want you to know that they're not to blame for the accident, but They will pay you money as a compensation. The man stood up. He looked afraid. How much money? He asked. £200, the man from Megan said. Mrs. White screamed, and a moment later she fell onto the floor. In a big cemetery, 2 miles from their home, Mr. and Mrs. White buried their son. Then they came back to their house, their hearts heavy with sadness. Their son was dead. It all happened so quickly. Mr. and Mrs. White could not think of a life without Herbert. The days passed, long, lonely, and silent. They did not speak to each other. There was nothing to talk about. About 2 weeks after Herbert's death, Mr. White woke up in bed. It was the middle of the night. He put out his hand, and his wife was not there. It was a dark room, but he could hear the sound of his wife crying near him. He laid and he listened. Come back to bed, he said after a while. It's cold. It's colder for Herbert, she said. Mr. White's eyes were heavy with sleep, and he soon fell asleep again. But then a long cry from his wife awoke him again. The paw, she cried, the monkey's paw. Mr. White sat up in bed. What's the matter? Mrs. White came out of the darkness of the room. Her eyes were wild and staring. I want the paw, she said. Where is it? Downstairs in the cupboard, said Mr. White. Why? Mrs. White laughed and cried at the same time. We have 2 more. 2 more of what? Mr. White asked. 2 more wishes, said Mrs. White. We have 2 more wishes. Was one not enough? Mr. White said angrily. You don't understand, cried Mrs. White. We can use the paw. Go and get it, and we can wish for our boy to be alive again. Mr. White stared at his wife. Are you mad? He asked. Get it, cried Mrs. White. Get it quickly and wish for Herbert's life depends on it. Get back into bed, said Mr. White. You don't know what you're saying. But Mrs. White continued. The first wish came true, she said, her eyes full of tears. Why not the second? Go and get it and make a wish. Herbert died more than 10 days ago, said Mr. White, his voice shaking. We cannot wish for this. Bring him back, said Mrs. White. Bring my boy back. Slowly, Mr. White got out of bed. He went downstairs into the kitchen. Then he opened the cupboard and looked in. The monkey's paw was still there. The wind howled outside, and the dark. Mr. White became afraid. His body went cold and his legs shook. With the paw in his hand, he went back upstairs and into the bedroom. His wife sat on the bed waiting. She watched him closely from mad eyes. Mr. White was afraid of his own wife. Make a wish, Mrs. White cried in a strong voice. Bring my boy back. Do it. I can't, said Mr. White. Do it, cried Mrs. White. Slowly, Mr. White held up his right hand and began to say the words, I wish my son alive again. Mr. White sat and waited. A candle burned at the corner of the room. Mrs. White looked out the window, but nothing happened. The wish didn't come true, thought Mrs. White. And Mr. White felt glad. Then the candle sputtered and went out. In the darkness, Mr. White slowly walked over to his bed again and got in. After some time, his wife came and sat on the bed. They didn't speak. Both heard the ticking of the clock downstairs. It was a windy night, and the house made other noises too. The stairs squeaked and the gate banged outside. After some time, Mr. White got out of bed. His wife sat silently. She stared into the dark. Mr. White found some matches. He lit one and went back downstairs for a candle. The wind still howled outside. At the bottom of the stairs, the match went out. Mr. White tried to light another. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, but it was a knock. A soft knock, the sound of knuckles against wood. The terror flooded through Mr. White's body. He dropped the matches on the floor. He stared at the door. The knock came again. This time, he turned and ran up the stairs to his room. He closed the bedroom door, but there was another knock from downstairs. What is that? Mrs. White cried. Nothing, said the old man. Another knock, this time loud and heavy. It's Herbert, said Mrs. White. It's him. She ran to the bedroom door, but Mr. White stood in front of her. He took her by the arm and held her. What are you going to do? He asked. It's my boy. It's Herbert, she cried. I forgot the cemetery was 2 miles away. Why are you holding me? Let me go. I must open the door. No, please, begged Mr. White. Don't let it in. Are you afraid of your own son? Screamed Mrs. White. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming. There was another knock, and then another, and another. The old woman broke free of her husband and ran down the stairs. He called after her, but she didn't stop. He followed her and heard the first bolt on the first door open. Come quick, his wife cried. I cannot free the second bolt. It's too high. But Mr. White didn't come to help her. He wanted to find the monkey's paw. He wanted to find it before the thing outside got in. More knocks at the door, long, slow, and loud. Mr. White looked up and saw his wife put a chair against the door and stand on it. His wife began to pull at the second bolt, but at the same moment, Mr. White found the monkey's paw and he made his last wish. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Mr. White heard the bolt slide, the chair go back, and the front door open. Then the cold wind howled, and so did his wife. He ran to the door. Outside, there was nothing but a quiet, empty street. And that's where the story ends. So the whole point of Monkey's Paw, the theme we see is be careful what you wish for. And what you guys will do below, tell me something you would wish for. And tell me why. But be careful, because it might come true.